All right, good afternoon. This is a talk that I decided to do last year after this happened. It's like yet another VC-funded company has hired all of the developers for an open source project and then suddenly switched to a non-open source license. This has happened a number of times. It happened again last month with Rediff. It's like, okay, surely there's a point where we can stop making this mistake again and again and again. What inspired me to talk about it, however, was reading the license that HashiCorp used. They did something I didn't expect and hadn't seen before. Firstly, the basic grant of license was for non-production use. So this is a typical, you can still have access to the source, but you're not allowed to use it in any commercially useful or economically useful way. Source available, not open source. Secondly, they thought it was interesting. They were fairly specific about that you can use it in production as long as you're not competing with HashiCorp's paid version of the licensed work. It's a reasonably narrow exclusion. It's narrower, for example, than MongoDB used several years ago. And I thought, okay, not terrible, not great, not open source, but they're doing the right thing. They later revised it and they went one step further and did something I've never seen before. And that was said that whether or not the thing is competitive is determined at the point where you took the license, not how HashiCorp's business changed later. For corporations who are embedding this into some sort of product, a database engine typically, this is one of the major risk areas for the don't compete with us licenses of the kind that Elastic and Mongo have used. But what you're agreeing is to not do something that's competitive with the grantor, but you don't know how the grantor's business will evolve over the next several years. So what HashiCorp did in the revised version of their license was also said, if our business changes after you take the code, and we're therefore in direct competition, that's fine. Your license is still valid. You don't get licenses for newer versions, but you don't suddenly lose the right to use the code that you've embedded just because we changed our business. So this is pretty impressive. It's not open source, but if you're looking for a way to sort of do the minimum damage possible, they're fairly good choices. But then I noticed something else that wasn't mentioned in their press release. This is actually comes from MariaDB, but they used it as is. And it's that there's a fallback option built into the license. This is not optional. This is not a promise about something they'll do in the future. It's a perfected grant today that says that you get full rights under some other license, in this case MPL2, what Firefox uses, 4 dates from the date of the release. It's not if we make a release or if we get around to it. It's a complete grant already. As a risk management measure for a company that might be looking to embed this into some other product, this is also important. This means that if HashiCorp as an organization fails, which anything up to 90% of VC-funded companies do, then it's not orphaned. You end up with the work disappearing into a black hole where no one sees it again. It automatically falls back into open source several years into the future. That might be a long period of time, but 4 years into the future is better than never. I noticed, however, when I saw this, that, hang on, I've seen this before. This idea comes up in a completely separate area of law that's unrelated to copyright, and that's estate law. It's used typically if someone comes into a lot of money and wants to look after their family members without risking spoiling them. So instead of handing the nieces and nephews a pile of cash, instead buy them a house and provide them with a life interest. They can't sell the house, they can't spend it, they can't hypothecate it to lenders, because after they die, it then goes to some other named party. This has been used in estate law for centuries as part of stabilizing family fortunes. So it's quite a well-tested area of law. I was thinking about explaining how this works, but when I got into detail, it's complicated, tedious, and doesn't actually teach us very much, other than to say that it is a well-understood approach. And so it's turning up in open source adjacent licensing is interesting. The other thing that I discovered after proposing the talk was that the Creative Commons group had already looked at this several years ago. Their brief is a bit different. They're not interested in software. They're more interested in authors of books or lyrics for songs or performances of songs. They were typically looking at much longer terms, 14 years for one project they built. And they were especially interested in what happens when the author dies. So it's not quite the same problem as the business software license solves. And in particular, they were looking at 3 different use cases. One about a license that springs into effect upon the death. There you go. One that springs into effect after a work has recouped its creating costs. This is like the Street Performer protocol, but saying we'll publish the work. I have a flat battery. And then we'll publish it on an open license once we've made enough money. And then finally, the idea that I'm talking about, which is a fixed period of time. The problem that Creative Commons picked up for 2 of the 3 cases that they were studying is that these require an organization. They require someone to keep track of whether or not the person's alive. That's not as easy as it sounds for a global project. And certainly evaluating whether the costs have been recouped and therefore triggering the transition to open requires a Okay, so yes, the important issue is that for the Creative Commons study, they were interested in all 3 use cases. And so the fact that this 3rd use case happens not to need an organization to hang around as trustee or escrow or some similar role was an interesting observation, but not critical to their study. Their study said, we need these, and that turned out to be a problem. They did build such a program, but it had very little uptake. And so what I'd point out is that for free and open source communities, you don't need this. The fact that the grants are automatic has been a really important part of how these licensing schemes have worked. And so I'd suggest that with respect to remainder type arrangements, we should be sticking here, not building in dependence upon a trustee or an escrow agent. The idea is not completely new. GoScript, almost from the outset, has been on a basis of we'll do our commercial licenses and then a year later for the same code, GPL. That was largely to keep a promise to Stallman, apparently. It's also in other fields. So open access academic journal articles usually have an embargo period. Or some, that's usual. Some journals allow you to publish on an open access basis so long as you give them a 12-month embargo first. So that in different shapes, this comes up in different places. And for much the same reason, that people who are to invest design or engineering work are looking for ways to earn a return on that work. And so one of the ways is at least a period of exclusivity rather than perpetual exclusivity. It is a compromise. This absolutely isn't, hey, we should build all open source projects this way. We should not. This is about improving the ability for open source projects to survive a particular kind of damage, and that's the risk of a VC acquiring them and then collapsing, not what we would want to see in a healthy project. The effects on free software and open source are slightly different, or they're aligned. Certainly, the commercial releases don't respect user freedom. So even if you've got this sort of delayed license option, you're nonetheless out there selling a commercial version that is non-freedom respecting. So it's clearly a very uncomfortable model for free software communities, and it discourages the formation of a healthy free software community around the project because you're in what's called a serial abandonware model. You're just receiving the next version, it's difficult to maintain a healthy project. But it provides a fail-safe. And this is the one that keeps burning us, is that projects get eaten and then the organization collapses. So it has some value. Open source, similar. What it does do fundamentally is prevent collaboration with competitors, which is unfortunate because that's exactly what the open source initiative was set up to do. That if you've got a bunch of people in large corporations who are working on infrastructure that doesn't affect customer buying decisions, there's no problem cooperating with programmers working in other organizations, even competitors, on your database layers or your other infrastructure. This gets in the way of that. Discourages a healthy community forming, as for the free software, provides the same fail-safe, and for business use, for businesses where I'm embedding components, it's a material risk mitigation. I've seen situations where we've had to pull out of a bid because we were reliant on a bit of software. We were stuck in an arrangement like this without the release to open source. So it's a risk reduction measure for businesses that want to incorporate open source components into a larger project. One of the issues here, and where I think the VCs in particular keep tripping over themselves, is not understanding where their crown jewels are. You've got to know what it is that you are selling to your customers. If you're a bank, what your customers care about is when they stick their card in the machine, cash comes out. They don't care what database you use. They don't care what languages you use, what operating system, what hosting provider. They care about, does the cash come out of the machine? However, so this first split is your engineering choices which affect customer purchase decisions. You never want to put that code in the hands of your competitors. It is positively harmful to put code that has that characteristic into open source. On the other hand, all of your other engineering choices don't affect customer purchase decisions, but they do affect the health of the organization. These are what Amazon calls undifferentiated heavy lifting. They're the stuff where you've got to spend engineering resource to make a useful product, but how you do it does not affect your customers' choices. And so the argument I'd make here is that, in general, you should never consider putting this stuff in open source. And if you set out to do it because you've heard that open source is fantastic and you want to paint everything open source, you're setting yourself up for disaster. Keep it separate. But if you absolutely can't, well, I'll get to that. But right. So, any South Park fans in the room? None at all. I won't explain this. Okay. Typical broken business plan. Do something that seems related to making money. Do we're not sure what. And then in phase 3, profit. In South Park, the underpants gnomes were stealing underpants. That was phase 1, but you know, it's the same idea. Profit for VCs, 10 to 30% of the time, but fail anywhere up to 90%. So, what's popular? Make everything FOSS, because that gets the developers to come and work for us, and make a cloud service, because that's how everyone makes money nowadays. Okay, but hang on. Oh my God. Amazon, Microsoft, and Google are now competing with us. Quick, throw all the open source overboard. This is the pattern. This is the reaction that keeps happening, and it keeps happening because this is a broken business model. It was a joke in South Park. You're not supposed to build companies this way. So it will take time to get this to sink in with VCs, but what I'm getting at here is that it makes sense for VCs to know where the crown jewels are, know what it is that's customer differentiating, but also avoid competing with the FOSS communities that created your crown jewels. Don't get into that situation in the first place. Make sure the thing you're selling is not the thing that the open source community created in the first place. They need to be separate. In the case of MariaDB, which is where the business source license that HashiCorp used came from, it's max scale. They've produced a mechanism, a proxy essentially, to allow much, much larger scaling for MariaDB than was possible before, and that component is under the business source license, whereas MariaDB proper is under GNU GPL. So to keep separate what you give away and what you sell. But also, don't compete with the hyperscalers. No VC-funded company is in a position to compete with Amazon, Google, or Microsoft. It's nuts. You can't do it. You'll do a lot of damage before you crash, but you are going to fail anyway, so why start? By all means, hire a FOSS project team. But again, make your money selling the corporate-specific bits. Don't try to sell the thing that was free before. And this is where the licensing thing comes up and why I think it's a good idea. If you absolutely must compete with hyperscalers because you're certain you have some compelling reason for doing so, at least think about the remainder of the FOSS communities. The VCs know they're going to fail most of the time. So there's no downside in putting a 2-line entry in your license that says, and 4 years later, it's available under GNU GPL, because who cares? If they haven't made a profit by then, their work is meaningless. They don't lose anything by making the grant. I haven't yet worked out how to shop this around to VCs, but I've spent time with advising startups, maybe. For the hyperscalers, don't be evil. Hopefully everyone recognizes that as Google's slogan. Google, please be Google, but the same with the other guys. Please remember where your components came from and support the health of the communities that those components came from. Now, to be fair, they're learning how. After the whole debacle with Elastic, Amazon finally picked up hosting a project to run the open source version of Elastic. Microsoft is doing, or Azure is doing little pieces. They're certainly major contributors to Postgres. I don't know about GCP, but I assume Google is doing similar things. So it is happening, but we are having to learn what the OSI was founded to do 20 years ago, we're now having to learn to do with much, much bigger corporations. And so it's a work in progress. Developers, choose full FOSS wherever you can. Think about whether you need the latest features. In the situation that I got into with Mongo, it actually didn't matter that we were running a 3-year-old version. For our application, it was not publicly exposed, so the security thing wasn't a concern. We were not using any of the new features. We were perfectly happy to keep working with the old open source version. So that's certainly one option. If you can't, prefer projects with a full FOSS remainder interest, like what's in the HashiCorp, the 2-line thing that says in 4 years it's open. Granted, I can only give you 2 examples at the moment. That was all a bit quicker than planned. Questions?